Then let's take our Bibles, please. We're going to turn to the book of Genesis, chapter 23. Genesis, chapter 23 this morning. Everyone have the notes? I guess so. There were plenty of notes this morning. And if you don't have the notes, just put your hand up. Brother Dan will get you some. We enjoyed teaching Genesis 22 the last couple of weeks. It's a tremendous story. Interestingly, I was on the Temple Institute not website, but their Facebook page. We have shared that with many of you, and very interesting things that are going on with the Temple Institute. And of course, they just got through. One of the benefits of that is they take you through the Jewish calendar. They just finished the Feast of Tabernacles. And at the Feast of Tabernacles, you might remember when we went through studying that they have the water libations. Well, they have instituted the Sanhedrin already in Israel. They have they're in the process of training the Kohanim, which is the tribe of Levi. And at the water libations, it's basically where they go down to the pool of Siloam, right at the very bottom of Mount Zion. They pick up in these silver vessels, water. They bring it up to the Temple Mount. Of course, they're not allowed to go on the Temple Mount, so there's another place in the Jewish quarter of Jerusalem, and they had sort of like a mock altar, and they poured out the wine, and which I didn't realize that I thought it was just water, but they pour out wine and water. And somebody had put on the Facebook page and illustrated or just mentioned that out of Jesus' side came blood and water, and then. Some Jewish person made a comment, and that's the thing about it. Most of the people on there are probably just going to be Jewish. some believers as well, some Christians too. But anyway, this Jewish person got on and said that would be all fine, except human sacrifice is an abomination in the sight of God. And he left that, and somebody else made another little comment, sort of bland comment. So I thought, well, that sort of needs to be answered. And so I went on and I said, well, it is true that human sacrifice in the sight of God is an abomination. I said, but why then did God command Abraham to sacrifice his own son? That would have been a human sacrifice. Why did he do that? And then I went through, remember all the points about going to the land of Moriah, up on one of the mountains on a donkey with wood on his back. And I mentioned all of those things all the way. I did mention Jesus one time, went all the way through. And then, and so, how God had promised he would provide himself to be the lamb. See, Jesus, in a sense, was a human sacrifice, but he was the God sacrifice. He was God come in the flesh, and that's the only sacrifice that was acceptable to God. But anyway, what happens is, and I was getting a lot of likes on there, and then overnight they come on, of course they're ahead of us while they're sleeping, we're getting the likes, and then when they come on, when they see that stuff, they take it off, Oh, they do, yes, they take it off. But I thought it was interesting because we just went through the study in Genesis 22, and it is a great chapter, especially for a Jewish person to read that, Okay, and human sacrifice was an abomination. That was part of the problem with the worship of Baal. They sacrificed infants, and God took it very, very hard, and he brought judgment upon them. And I mentioned that, but then why does he have this picture of Abraham sacrificing his son, And of course it was picturing the sacrifice of God's only begotten Son. Well, we're in chapter 23, so let's look at chapter 23, and we're going to read it. This is about the death of Sarah. Verse 1, and Sarah was 107 and 20 years old. These were the years of the life of Sarah. And Sarah died in Kirjath Arba, the same as Hebron, in the land of Canaan. And Abraham came to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. And Abraham stood up from before his dead, and spake unto the sons of Heth, saying, I am a stranger and a sojourner with you. Give me a possession of a burying place with you, that I may bury my dead out of my sight. And the children of Heth answered Abraham, saying unto him, Hear us, my lord, thou art a mighty prince among us. In the choice of our sepulchres bury thy dead. None of us shall withhold from thee his sepulchre, but that thou mayest bury thy dead. And Abraham stood up and bowed himself to the people of the land, even to the children of Heth. And he communed with them, saying, If it be your mind that I should bury my dead out of my sight, hear me, and entreat for me to Ephron the son of Zoar, that he may give me the cave of Machpelah, which he hath, which is in the end of his field, For as much money as it is worth, he shall give it me for a possession of a burying amongst you. And Ephron dwelt among the children of Heth, and Ephron the Hittite answered Abraham in the audience of the children of Heth, even all that went in at the gate of his city, saying, Nay, my lord, hear me. The field give I thee, and the cave that is therein I give it thee. In the presence of the sons of my people give I it thee. Bury thy dead. And Abraham bowed down himself before the people of the land, and he spake unto Ephron in the audience of the people of the land, saying, But if thou wilt give it, I pray thee, hear me. I will give thee money for the field. Take it of me, and I will bury my dead there. And Ephron answered Abraham, saying unto him, My lord, hearken unto me. The land is worth 400 shekels of silver. What is that betwixt me and thee? Bury therefore thy dead. And Abraham hearkened unto Ephron. And Abraham weighed to Ephron the silver, which he had named in the audience of the sons of Heth, 400 shekels of silver, current money, with the merchant. And the field of Ephron which was in Machpelah, which was before Mamre, the field and the cave which was therein, and all the trees that were in the field, that were in all the borders round about, were made sure unto Abraham for possession in the presence of the children of Heth, before all that went in at the gate of his city. And after this Abraham buried Sarah his wife in the cave of the field of Machpelah, before Mamre, the same as Hebron in the land of Canaan. And the field and the cave that is therein were made sure unto Abraham for possession of a burying place by the sons of Heth. Well, let's look at verse 1. We've got three main points here this morning. First of all, the years of Sarah. And it's a simple verse 1, but I think it's pregnant with meaning. And Sarah was 107 and 20 years old. These were the years of the life of Sarah. And so Sarah died, and she was 127 years. Now that's a good old age. Abraham, of course, lived much longer than her, and actually was married again. We'll find that, I think it's in chapter 25. But here, the life of Sarah ends. She lived a good life, a long life. And she had been by Abraham's side for over 100 years as his wife. Many experiences, both good and bad, both sad and joyful. And now her days were fulfilled. And so it says, these were the years of the life of Sarah. You know, you and I don't know how many years we've got. Sarah didn't know. Later on we'll find that Isaac thought that he was dying, and they still had another 35 years to go, something like that. But the Bible says that we should so teach us to number our days, that we may apply our hearts unto wisdom, Psalm 90 verse 12. And so we should seek to use all the days and all the years of our life to honor the Lord. And certainly Sarah was a wonderful woman. In fact, she's the only woman in the Bible where it mentions the years of her life concerning her death and concerning her burial. And actually, this is the first burial that you find in the Bible. This is the first funeral you find. Obviously, there were many before this, but this is the first one that is mentioned. And so Sarah was a very special woman. And we'll see this in just a little bit. She's considered, associated with the patriarchs, with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, obviously the wife of Abraham and the mother of Isaac, and so it was very special in the eyes of Judaism, and also very special in the religion of Islam as well. So the years of Sarah, 127 years old, and she died. Verse number 2, it says, and Sarah died. And of course, this is the story of the Bible all the way through. God told Adam, the day that thou eatest thereof, thou shalt surely die. And then he gives those lists in chapter 4, I think, of Genesis. And they died, and they died, and they died, and they died. And so it was with Sarah also. And Sarah died. And she died in Kirjath Arba. And that's the name that was used before Hebron. Kirjath Arba. Kirjath means the city of. Arba was the person, obviously, who lived. It was associated with that city, Kirjath Arba. The same as Hebron. The word Hebron means association in the land of Canaan. And so Abraham came to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. So Sarah died in Hebron. I want you to look and find out where Hebron is. Now, can anybody remember where Abraham lived? If you go over to Genesis, chapter 22, verse number 19, notice it says, so Abraham returned unto his young men, and they rose up and went together to Beersheba, and Abraham dwelt at Beersheba. So where did Abraham live, and where did Sarah live? Well, they lived in Beersheba, and this is a modern map of Israel right here. This is Jerusalem up here. This is the Dead Sea, obviously. So we're not seeing all of it. Here's Beersheba. It's down in the Negev desert. And here's Jerusalem up here. This is a Spain. This is a mountain range, that runs right down here. And you're going from about 2,000 feet above sea level to 1,500 feet below sea level down here. And then, of course, you're at sea level here. So this rises up to these mountains and then back down deep into the valley of the Jordan Valley. So here's Jerusalem, and here's Beersheba, and Hebron is right in the middle. So it's 20 miles from Beersheba to Hebron, and 20 miles from Hebron to Jerusalem. So it's right in the middle. Which poses the question, why did she die in Hebron instead of Beersheba? And I believe that I don't know what the reason was, but somehow Sarah did not die at home. I was speaking with Leslie about this, and she said maybe she was at the mall, because they were here. Now, obviously, this would have been, they dwelt in tents, and they had flocks and many flocks and different animals to feed on the pastures and so on. I don't know why she would have been there, but she was there. And it's interesting in verse number 2 that it says, "And Abraham came to mourn for Sarah," which possibly means that Abraham wasn't with her when she died. Okay, so he may have been still down here, and she was up here, doing something. Maybe she was visiting somebody. Maybe she realized she was sick and she went to see some sort of a doctor. I don't know. But it seems that she was not home, and so that often, that means that it was a sudden death, because if it was a lingering sickness that she had, then Abraham would have been at her side, and so it must have been sudden. He wasn't there. He had to come to where she was. And so, in one sense, maybe we realize that Sarah didn't suffer much if it was a sudden death. She wasn't lingering in pain, and that's obviously a blessing. Sudden death is often a blessing, not for the people here left behind, because it's a shock for us. And really, any kind of grief or mourning is really it's our loss, it's our pain. The person who's gone on, if they're with the Lord, their pain's over. And their suffering's over, and so our grief is really, when you think about it, our grief is really not for them. Our grief is for ourselves and our sense of loss. And sometimes it's important to understand those things. That, and certainly for Abraham, when you think that he wasn't there, I'm sure he would have wanted to be there. And that poses some interesting facts about life and death and the process of death. You and I do not get to choose the time or the place of our death. There was a thing in the news recently where this young lady, tragic story, had a disease, and she was going to end her life, going to Oregon, where they practice apparently euthanasia. Euthanasia is the practice where basically you commit suicide, or it's assisted suicide, where maybe a person's got an incurable illness, or maybe it's a horrible death, there's pain involved or whatever, and so they decide to take their own lives. That's what euthanasia is. Now, it's not biblical, it's not scriptural. It's basically murder. Suicide is self-murder, and nobody has the right to do that. Only God has the right to take life and to end your life. Now, people say, well, if your dog was in pain or your horse was in pain, you would put it down. I know, but that's an animal. We are made in the image of God, and human life has a different value altogether. Now, if you believe in evolution and we're just animals, then they don't see the distinction, and that's why people can do that and blame us for being inhumane or whatever. But no, a God that reserves the right to take life, and so it's important that we understand that euthanasia or suicide or self-assisted death is not an option for those who want to please the Lord. We do not get to choose the time or the place of our death, and sometimes there's complications with that. Abraham could have said to himself, why wasn't I there with her? Why did that not happen here at home? There may be circumstances surrounding the death of your loved ones, and you think, well, why did that happen? Or would it not have? I wish I had been there. Or I wish I had spoken to the person, didn't get to say goodbye, this type of thing, or maybe they went out of the house in a rage, or they were mad at you, and there was never any reconciliation, and they died in a wrong relationship with you or other people, and there's always opportunities for regret there. And maybe Abraham regretted the fact that he wasn't there with Sarah. But you and I don't get to choose those details of our lives and of our death and the death of our loved ones. And what do you do in those situations? Well, you just have to take it as from the Lord, that the Lord is sovereign in those things, that those things are providential. And sometimes those things are very difficult and we don't understand all the reasons why. But we have to relinquish that into God's care and leave those things with Him. And we could say more about that, but sometimes those things are very difficult. And there is regret, and there's things we'd want to change, and there's pain involved in that. But you've got to take those situations and say, Lord, there's nothing that you can do about that now. You've got to leave it with God and let Him give you the peace that comes from Him only. And Abraham certainly would have had to done that. He could have thought, well, I wish I'd have been there, or I wish it hadn't been this sudden, or there have been a lot of wishes or what ifs, but Abraham had to make peace with that and just know that those things are in the hands of the Lord. And so Sarah, his soulmate, his wife of all these years, had gone to be with the Lord. Now in verse number 3 through 20, this is the bulk of the passage, and it has to do with the burial of Sarah. So in verse 3 it says, and Abraham stood up from before his dead and spake unto the sons of Heth. Now the Jews always bury quickly. In some cultures, in our culture here, it seems in Northern Ireland, you're talking maybe 3 or 4 days, something like that, from the time of death to burial. Jewish people usually try to bury the exact same day, so it's not something that they hang about with. It's something that it's immediate, really. And here Abraham, the shock of hearing what has happened, and maybe he's had to travel. It's about 20 miles, but you'll understand this is all up and down. It's 20 miles as a crow flies, but if you do a Google search of, in fact, you have to go up here and come down here and up around here if you're going on a bus to Hebron, and they say it's about 40 miles if you're actually going down the roads and up over the hills and all the rest of it. So it's 20 miles as a crow flies, but it's quite a long distance if you're going to walk it. It may have taken Abraham, depending where he was, maybe a whole day to get there. And so there was no time to lose. And in the midst of Abraham's grief, he has to deal with, where am I going to bury her? Now, it wasn't that they had their plots all picked out and paid for. Understand, these were pilgrims passing through. They were strangers in the land. Their home was over in Ur the Chaldees. That's where all their people had died and were buried. And so where was Abraham going to bury his wife? And in the midst of all the emotion and grief, he has to stand up and, in a sense, set that emotion aside and deal with the details of burial. And that's always a very stressful thing for families, in the midst of your grief, and then you got to work out all the details of funerals and coffins and all this. And I think it probably is a good idea for people to work ahead of time and maybe get with a funeral home and organise their things ahead of time. Miss Ione, she's got everything all organised. She's told me what she wants preached and got it all. She's got it all written down, what she wants sung at her funeral and all the rest of it. So I think it's a good thing because it takes the stress off the other family members in the midst of all of that emotion. But what place would it be? Would Abraham take her back to Ur of the Chaldees? See, God had told him to stay in Canaan, and even when he went down into Egypt, remember, it was a bad thing. And so that's exactly what they were going to do. They were going to stay. And when you say you're going to get buried in a certain place, I mean, that's in your mind, you're there to stay. Do you remember the slides when Brother Bowman was showing them on the Wednesday night of the trip to Congo, and he showed the grave, and there was one main headstone, and that was the original missionary that went there and died there and was buried there. His grave is still there, and I guess some of his family are there too. I think a couple of his sons or something were there. When David Livingstone died, the great missionary in Africa, they came and got his body and they took it back to London, and he's actually buried in Westminster Abbey alongside Charles Darwin of all people. But There he is, buried with all the kings and the queens and all the greats. David Livingstone, the great missionary to Africa. But before they allowed his body to be taken from the village, the natives went in there and opened his chest, and they reached in and they pulled out his heart, and they cut his heart out of his body. And they went out, and I think it was under a tree. They dug a hole under a tree, and they put David Livingstone's heart in the ground and buried his heart. And they took his body back, but he says his heart belongs in Africa, because that's where his heart was. And that's interesting, isn't it? But you know, when you think this is where I'm going to be buried, that's where in your mind you're saying, I'm here to stay. And so Abraham wanted Sarah, and really Sarah was the first of the patriarchs to go. And in the same place where Sarah would be buried, in this cave of Machpelah, Abraham would be buried, Isaac would be buried, Rebekah would be buried, Jacob would be buried, and Leah would be buried. Now Rachel actually died in childbirth, and she was buried at Bethlehem. Now the tombs, we're going to see some photographs in a little bit of the tomb of Abraham's cave, Abraham's tomb there in Hebron. It's still there. In fact, it's a point of great division between the Palestinians and the Jewish people. It's still there today. And so this is the burial of the patriarchs. And so now he has to go. Now, he speaks to the inhabitants of Hebron, to Heth. In verse number 5, it says, And the children of Heth answered Abraham, saying unto him, Hear us, my Lord, thou art a mighty prince among us. Now the word Heth, you know what the word Heth means? Very interesting. It means terror. Terror. And the descendants of Heth really have been terrorists. Certainly in modern times, have been a thorn in the side of the Jewish people. But the name means terror. Esau married 2 daughters of the sons of Heth. Actually, the Hittites were there. Look over at Genesis chapter 46, chapter 26, verse 34. Now, Abraham had a respectful relationship with these people, but these were the Canaanites. And you remember, this is the early days of Israel in the land. This is before they went down into Egypt. When they came back up out of Egypt, the iniquity of the Amorite was full, and God was bringing Joshua in to judge these people. But this is before that period of time. Abraham had a wonderful testimony. But these people were not good people. Verse 34, Esau was 40 years old when he took to wife Judith, the daughter of Beeri, the Hittite, and Bashemath, the daughter of Elon, the Hittite. Now watch, which were a grief of mind unto Isaac and Rebekah. These daughter-in-laws were absolute nightmares. Look over to chapter 27, verse 46. And Rebekah said to Isaac, I am weary of my life because of the daughters of Heth. And even though they were Hittites, they were in the land of Canaan, and they were mingled through this tribe or this family, those who dwelt in Hebron, Heth. And so she calls them the daughters of Heth, even though they were from 2 different families, 2 different fathers. But she calls them the daughters of Heth. She says, I am weary of my life because of the daughters of Heth. If Jacob take a wife of the daughters of Heth, such as these, which are of the daughters of the land, what good shall my life do me? In other words, she says, see, when Jacob gets a wife, he better go back to the land of the Chaldeans. And of course, that's what Jacob did. He went back to Laban, which was Rebekah's brother, and Laban had 2 daughters, Leah and Rachel, and that's where Jacob got his wives. But Rebekah says, I don't want him to be marrying the daughters of this land, these daughters of Heth. They're an absolute disaster. They're a nightmare. They're wicked. They knew not the God of Israel. And you know, it's really, really important who you marry, and who your sons marry, who your daughters marry. It's very, very important that we point them in the right direction. And it's an amazing thing that God gives us the most important decisions of life when we're probably least able to handle them. But the decision of the person you marry is so very, very important. And Esau messed up, and his mommy and daddy suffered because of it, and he did too. But anyway, verse number 6, as we go back to chapter 23, he says, Hear us, my Lord, thou art a mighty prince among us. In the choice of our sepulchres bury thy dead. None of us shall withhold from thee his sepulchre, but that thou mayest bury thy dead. And we see the respect that Abraham had among these people. You know, it was very important for Abraham to have a good testimony. and a good reputation before the Canaanites. You remember the story. Look at the time it is. We have no clock on the back wall, so you remember when the sons of Jacob, when his daughter had been basically raped, and the daughters of Jacob went in and basically wiped out the whole village of the men who did that. And the way that it was done, Jacob, he says, "You have made my name to stink in the land." It was very, very important for the patriarchs that even though they were sojourners in the land, that they had a good testimony before those people, that they were righteous before them. And Abraham certainly did, and he was respectful of them. He followed their traditions. In verse number 8, he says, "Entreat for me the Ephron, the son of Zohar." They're saying, "Look, use one of our sepulchres," and he wouldn't have it. He wouldn't do it. But he already had a place picked out. There's a field that had trees in it. It was before the plain of Mamre. And let me just show you some pictures here. Here's Hebron. This is a modern map. When you zero, this is on Google, right? So you Google down, and here's the cave of the patriarchs. Here it is in Hebron. This is the wider city of Hebron. This is in the West Bank. This is actually the caves. This is built above the caves. This is the tomb of the patriarchs right here in Hebron, and it's a very interesting place. But anyway, it's basically built right over these caves of Machpelah. He already picked it out, and he said, "Entreat for me to the Ephron, that he might sell me his land." And of course, that was part of their culture. Then Ephron says, from verse 11 to verse 16, verse 11, he says, "Nay, my Lord, hear me, the field give I thee." He says, "Look, don't worry about it. Let me just give it to you." Now, that probably was just a cultural gesture. He probably didn't mean for Abraham to take that up, but even if he did, Abraham was not going to do it. You know, there's an important lesson here for us as believers. Sometimes Christians go begging in Jesus' name, especially in church work. They're looking for favors for the Lord, favors for the church work. Can you give this for the church? Can you give the church a break on this and that and other? And anything the church buys, they want it for nothing. They want to basically rob the person that's giving, or that's selling the property, or selling the goods, or selling the materials. I'm going to tell you something, that's not right. I think the Lord's offended by that. The Lord owns the cattle on 1,000 hills, the wealth in every man. And the Lord doesn't need us to go begging for Jesus. Now, if somebody, because of their own conviction, wants to be a blessing to the church, and they want to donate something, that's their business. But as the leadership of the church, as people in the church, we should never be going looking for favors just because it's the Lord's work. And Abraham didn't do it. In fact, they said, "Well, what's it worth?" "It's worth 400 shekels. He says, "Well, I'm going to pay it, every penny of it." And it's interesting because some years ago, they were evicting the Hebrew settlers, the Jewish settlers from Hebron in the West Bank, and there was absolute riots over it. And the thought came to me, one of the reasons was because this is the only piece of ground that actually Abraham bought. The rest of it later on, when Joshua would come in, was given by God, who owns all the lands, given to the nation of Israel. But Abraham had actually bought this ground, signed, sealed, and delivered in the ears of the sons of Heth and of Ephron. And so this ground actually does belong to the Jews, in a greater sense more than all the rest of it, because he actually bought it. That's not to say that they don't own the land, because God gave them all of that land. But that's why they were so upset about it. And they were so upset about it because the graves of the patriarchs are Abraham and Sarah and Isaac and Rebekah and Jacob and Leah. Now, Islam only claims Abraham and Sarah. They go not for Isaac, they go for Ishmael. But it's Isaac and Jacob. He's the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And the Jews are saying, "Well, what claim have I to this site?" It's built into a mosque, okay? And of course, that's what Islam does. They conquer and they usurp. That's another story. So he bought the place for the full price. Look down on your notes there. 400 shekels. 1 shekel is 2/5 of an ounce. 400 shekels is 160 ounces, or 10 pounds. At today's rate of silver is $17.39 an ounce, times 10 pounds. So the present value today would be $2,782.40. Not really a whole lot of money for a rich man. Abraham was rich and Ephron was rich. That's why he says in verse 15, what is that betwixt me and thee? Bury therefore thy dead. But it was interesting, Abraham was made it a point to own that land, that he may be buried in it. And of course, he was considering not just himself, but others. Look at Genesis 49 real quick, and then we'll look at some photographs here. Genesis 49 is the deathbed of Jacob, and he instructs where he should be buried, and all who, it basically names all who would be buried there in verse 28. And all these are the 12 tribes of Israel, and this is that their father spake unto them, bless them every one according to his blessing he blessed them. And he charged them and said unto them, I am to be gathered unto my people. Bury me with my fathers in the cave that is in the field of Ephron the Hittite, in the cave that is in the field of Machpelah, which is before Mamre, in the land of Canaan, which Abraham bought. And notice how Jacob reiterates this whole idea that Abraham bought this ground. It belongs to us. Abraham bought with the field of Ephron the Hittite for possession of a burying place. There they buried Abraham and Sarah his wife. There they buried Isaac and Rebekah his wife. And there I buried Leah. The purchase of the field and of the cave that is therein was from the children of Heth. And when Jacob had made an end of commanding his, I love this bit, commanding his sons, he gathered up his feet into the bed and yielded up the ghost and was gathering on these people. You think Jacob was afraid to die? He was just taking care of business. And then he lifted up his feet and he says, I'm out of here. Feet up and gone. Anyway, let me show you some pictures. This is this is the plain of Mamre here. And if you look real close, that's the building we're looking at right there. I've got it circled here, I think. Right there, you'll see that wall around there. Now that wall, there's something special about that wall. This place right here, built over the cave, and I wonder who the smart people are who can tell me what is the special thing about this building right here. And the clue is in the bricks. When we talked about the temple, the second temple, which was extended by Herod the Great. Herod the Great was a tremendous builder. He built a maritime port at Caesarea using hydraulic cement. It was unbelievable. The guy was an absolute genius. He was the one that built the temple of Jesus' time. Do you remember there was something about his signature rocks, the signature bricks, the signature stones? It had a border around it. Do you remember that? Do you see right here the border? See the border? There's a border around every one of those stones. This actually was put together. You see the border? See the little indentations? This actually was built by Herod the Great. This was standing at the time of Christ. And Herod, of course, the reason he built the temple, the reason he built this, he was trying to placate the Jews. He was trying to actually really atone for his own wickedness. And so he treated the Jews with, at that point, as far as their buildings, he did a lot of work. Anyway, this is what it looks inside. They have different stations for the different patriarchs. Cenotaphs, they call it, but it's basically a Muslim mosque, and inside you'll have the Muslims worshipping. But the Jews are allowed into part of it. They can't get to all of it, but they're allowed into part of it. There's a whole history behind this, and you can actually Google it. It's just amazing, the wranglings over this particular tomb. Now here's a shaft, and they have it all padlocked and stuff. It's a narrow shaft that goes down into the cave, the first cave. It's actually a room above the cave. And when the Israelis won the Six-Day War in 1967, they took the Temple Mount. They also took the West Bank and Hebron. And one of the ministers of Israel at that time, one of the politicians, he was an amateur archaeologist. He was very interested in this. He got a 11-year-old girl, a little skinny girl, and they opened that up and they put her down there with a flashlight, and she went down to see. She was the only one skinny enough to get into it, to see what she could see, and then she came back up. Apparently below this, and you've got a little diagram here on your notes. We'll try and explain that. It's not very clear, but we'll try and explain that in just a moment. It's really interesting. See this here, paint? I just noticed this. When they painted these railings, they've got green paint everywhere. Obviously it was, somebody didn't know what they were doing. This here is what you've got on your, this is looking at a section of the underground area, okay? This one at the bottom is the same thing, only looking down from the top, okay? And so inside, this is the little porthole we were talking about, where the girl was lowered down through here. And this is what they call the lamp room. And this is connected to a corridor that goes up. She found this stairway. This is all blocked off. They didn't know there was a second entrance to it, and she found that. Later on, they went in, and there's a square tile in the floor right here, apparently. And when they lifted that up, then they could actually go down into the cave. They said there was actually 3 caves, although you only see 2 here. The word McMinnville means double. And maybe that's in reference to like a double cave. So there was the main cave, and then there was an inner cave. And so this is looking down on it. This would have been this shaft right here, this narrow shaft right here. And this is the cave, the first cave, and then the little entrance, and then the inner cave. And then in this inner cave, there's other reports of other people before the 67, back 100, 150 years ago, where they went in there. And the report was that there were 6 caskets. Basically, there was one on one side. This would have been Abraham. This would have been Sarah. This would have been Isaac. This would have been Rebecca. This was Jacob, and this was Leah. There's 6 of them in there. Now, we don't know. And obviously, the thing's locked up. You can't go into it today because of the whole political situation. There's no way that archaeologists could go in and dig everything up. They just wouldn't do it. But isn't that interesting that you could actually go, maybe possibly go to that casket, open it up, and you'd be looking at what's left of Abraham and Sarah. Isn't that an amazing thing? There's many artist drawings about this. This is supposed to be Abraham here, looking lovingly back at Sarah. Notice in this picture they have some of the Jews bury them standing up, and they have Sarah standing up, and of course this probably would have been possibly Isaac and Ishmael, who would have been there to bury Sarah. Okay, so that's basically our time is up there. So the death of Sarah, a wonderful woman, and obviously none of us are exempt from the enemy of death. The only exemption will be if the Lord comes in the air for us, and we shall go to heaven without dying. Oh, happy day. Lord, thank you for the time we've had together. Thank you for your precious word. We're grateful, Lord, for the promises of it. Lord, surely we don't know the day of our death. We do not know the years of our life. Lord, this might be our last day today, and we can't control those things. But Lord, we trust you that in your providence and in your sovereignty and your will that you do all things right and all things well. And Lord, sometimes they're not what we expect or what we would have hoped for. And Lord, when we are disappointed, when we are grieved in those situations of life and death, help us, Lord, to realize that there is a God in heaven who knows, who cares, and Lord, who controls. And help us, Lord, to let go of those things. And help us, Lord, to trust you with the things that we don't understand and the what-ifs. And Lord, we thank you for the testimony of Abraham. His faith in God was strong, even though maybe he didn't understand why Sarah was taken so suddenly, or why he wasn't there. And help us learn, Lord, to learn from his example. For we ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.